a real pleasure to have you all here for what I hope and expect is going to be a really lively, interesting discussion. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Harry Farmer. I'm a senior researcher here at the Ada Lovelace Institute. And together with my colleague Julia Slatman, we are together and we have been working on a project over the past few months, indeed over the past year, on an emerging class of AI systems that we are calling AI assistants, advanced AI assistants, and that's what we're here to be talking about today. So what are advanced AI assistants? Well, in very broad terms, these are tools powered by foundation models that are designed to be talked to, that are designed to play the kind of roles that you might otherwise expect of and assign to a human. And in essence, what that really means is we might describe these systems as executors, tools that will carry out tasks for you in the world. There might be advisors, which will provide you with very specific specialist advice. And also, we are often talking about what we call interlocutors. So these are systems whose primary function is to act on you, the user. So here we're thinking AI companions, AI boyfriends, AI girlfriends, but also things like AI tutoring apps, mental health apps as well. Now, over the course of a few months here at Ada, we've been thinking about what this new class of systems could mean for our society, for our economy, and also for our politics. In a report that we put out in November called The Dilemmas of Delegation, we set out some of the policy challenges these kind of tools might pose in the near future. And then in a legal review, the regulation of delegation that we published a few weeks later, we examined the extent to which current laws, regulations might address these challenges. And for those of you who come to the seminar without doing the recommended pre-reading, who you are, rest assured Julia is going to be taking you through some of the details and some of the headline findings of those two reports. And that is with a view to setting up what I think will be a really interesting panel discussion. Chaired, we are very lucky to have Professor Karen Young from the University of Birmingham here to be chairing that discussion. We also have Max Wantu from the Open Markets Institute, Alex Lawrence Archer from AWO, the Digital Rights Agency, and Tim Bond from the Specialist Technology team at Ipsos. And rest assured, once you've grown tired of hearing us squabbling about all these topics, we're going to be throwing the floor open to you and we're going to be taking questions from the audience. Before I hand over, though, I really want to stress two things. The first is that all of the challenges that we identified associated with advanced AI assistants, so challenges around privacy, cybersecurity, worries about mental health, worries about cognitive and social reskilling, questions about the disruption to the status of regulated professions like law. Amongst all of those things, the questions that really interested us and that we have decided to run with at the Ada Lovelace Institute over the next few months relate to the role that these tools have and could come to play as what we are calling universal digital intermediaries. So if you listen to a lot of the signals coming out of Silicon Valley, a lot of the signals coming from big tech, a lot of the expectation and indeed a lot of the aspiration for these sorts of systems is that they are going to become the primary means by which most of us interact with the internet, digital information and software in the future. So gone will be the Google search bar and in will be an AI agent that you will talk to, which will provide various things for you. That would be a model of computer use were it to be realized that puts those sorts of systems and the companies providing with them in a position of subtle but enormous power. In practical terms, it could amount to giving a single class of highly persuasive, personalized systems the ability to determine what information, what viewpoints, which ideas, what opinions people are exposed to and what they're not, and also how those things are presented and framed. Now, the questions of what that could mean for our markets, for our politics, for our democracy, and indeed what we can do about this is going to be the focus of our work here at Ada. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. The second thing that I want to stress, a bit of a cliche though it is that today represents the beginning of a longer research process, the beginning of a longer conversation. These questions that we've assigned ourselves are really difficult ones. They are unlikely to have easy, straightforward solutions, which is why we are so pleased to be able to mull them over with our panel and with all of you this evening. And that's why we are keen to keep this conversation going over the coming months. So if you'd like to be part of that conversation, please do reach out to us or just come and grab us afterwards. Finally, a little bit of housekeeping. Be aware that this event is being recorded. We are just pointing the cameras at us. We're not pointing at the audience. And we're not going to be recording the Q&A session. So if you do feel the cold, steely layer of the camera on you, we promise you it's not us. Right, we have a lot to get through. We have really packed, exciting agenda, so I will detain you no longer and I'll hand over to Julia.
Thank you, Harry. For the next few minutes, I'll talk you through some of the findings that we found in our research thus far. So in our first report, we've analyzed and summarized some of the biggest policy challenges that are presented by advanced AI systems. We've separated these challenges out into 3 different types of challenges, namely technical challenges, misuse challenges, and systemic challenges. The technical challenges, you can think about things around hallucination or whether the information provided is accurate, the opacity of systems, alignment issues, the way whether or not AI systems align with user values or bigger societal values, but also questions around loss of control. The misuse challenges focus, for instance, on maybe scamming fraud. I think we've also had headlines around cloud being used for a large scale cyber attack, those kind of risks. But also the ability to create and amplify this information and maybe providing bad actors with very critical information around how to provide weapons of different kinds. What we'll focus on most today are the systemic challenges that Harry already briefly spoke about. So universal digital intermediaries, basically assistants, I should briefly into assistants, how they mediate information and ideas and products that we get to see. It's not just about which parts of the digital world we get to see, but also how they're framed and presented to us, and the kind of information that these systems have about us, and how they're use that information to make that information less appealing to us. And added layer to this level of control is the level of trust that systems tend to engender in people. They are designed to have all the cues that kind of tell us that we're interacting with a human. And there has been some recent research, for instance, by the AI Security Institute, that these systems can be very, very persuasive, also when it comes to more political topics. And of course, we've also seen headlines around people developing unhealthy dependencies and as a consequence of the developing adverse mental health impact as a result of engaging with these systems over longer periods of time. So we get this combination of powerful systems that are able to control the kind of information that we see, but also that we come to rely upon and kind of see maybe as our friend or a trusted advisor. And this creates a situation where these AI systems become our trusted intermediaries. At a larger scale, this can have very, very big impacts. On the one hand, on our information ecosystem, because these chatbots, they're able to control the kind of IDs that are pushed and the kind of information that is shared with different groups in society. And subsequently, this may impact on the kind of topics that gain salience in our democracies, the kind of parties that get pushed forward, and all these kind of questions. We saw it recently, I'm from the Netherlands, that our data protection authority told people not to talk to ChatGPT about getting political recommendations because information was biased, it was often inaccurate, and simply not reliable. And we've also seen Winch here in the UK offer similar recommendations just for last month that consumers should not rely on the kind of information given by chatbots as it might skew or be inaccurate in some kind of way. Secondly, as we might come to rely on the system recommending us products and services, this can also really significantly shape our economic structures. We don't know why certain products or services are recommended over others, but we do know that more and more people are asking Claude, ChatGPT, or maybe other services that they're using, hey, I'm looking for a new pair of pens or maybe a new kitchen supplies. Can you recommend me where to get that? And it will provide you with a very helpful list of options where to look at. We don't know why certain options are given over others, and this is not the kind of information that we can access through the kind of rights that we currently have. Combined with the fact that these systems have a lot of personalized data about us, they can also provide us with very personalized kind of recommendations, which makes the kind of products and services they recommend to us all the more persuasive and interesting. At a larger scale, this can distort markets and potentially also disempower consumers. So overall, this leads to a concentration of power in the hands of the tech companies that are controlling these kinds of assistants. And they can promote certain ideas and products over others, and we don't really have control over why that happens and how that happens and which kind of groups of people are targeted with that. This is a very short summary of all the different kinds of challenges that we set out in our first report. In our second report that we published just last week, we decided to translate some of those challenges into scenarios that we investigated with our partner organization, AWO. So we basically asked some lawyers to help us figure out, okay, given all these challenges, do we already have the laws and regulations in place that can help us manage some of those risks? Unfortunately, the short answer is no. So we used the challenges to design 4 different scenarios. The first scenario considered mental health harm, so a situation in which a user might be engaging with a chatbot that is marketed as a mental well-being assistant. And over time, they start getting worse and worse mental health impacts, and the assistant doesn't refer them to appropriate help. The second scenario concerns financial loss as a result of a user relying on an assistant for investments, recommendations, and purchasing decisions, but that over time makes suboptimal decisions for the user, and as a result, they lose out on money or maybe also better products. The third scenario considers loss of income and loss of opportunity as a result of receiving incorrect legal advice from a legal advisor assistant that is employed by a legal aid center. And the fourth scenario discusses an assistant that influences a user's political opinion over a longer period of time. We found, in short, although there is a nuance between these scenarios where some had a bit more sort of traction in law than others, but that overall there is not enough protection in the law in England and Wales to protect us from these harms. There's multiple reasons for this. For one, we don't have currently in the UK dedicated regulation that focuses on AI, let alone AI assistance. And so the legal coverage we do have comes from sort of a patchwork of horizontal and vertical regulations. So horizontal like GDPR, for example, or consumer protection law, vertical, maybe some sector-specific regulation like financial services regulation or medical regulation. Where this kind of regulation does apply, it is very often an all or nothing kind of situation. So something is a medical device or it isn't. And if it falls outside of that, all that extra sort of protection is gone. And also those kind of legal gray areas can be exploited because companies are very smart in the way that they market these technologies and place them onto the market. Also, assistants do prevent some novel issues in the law. So for instance, what is the legal status when an assistant makes a decision? Is that something that can be relied on in court, or is it still always going to fall back onto the user? That is kind of unclear. And also, very importantly, assistants tend to create more sort of diffuse, nuanced kind of harms that are not really well covered in our legal system in general. So think about emotional harms where our ability to independently form opinions are being impacted. But these are not the kind of risks that our legal system is really apt at dealing with. And these kinds of harms are not necessarily new in and of themselves. We've seen them before. We know that humans with each other can have unhealthy relationships. We know that humans can influence each other in manipulative ways. But it is new that this kind of relationship happens in a commercial context with a product that is designed to kind of engender this level of trust. And when there's a commercial sort of interest behind having this kind of interaction with the user and push them towards certain opinions and choices. So this is essentially somewhat new legal territory, and we might have to be a little bit creative in thinking about how we're going to pick up these kind of challenges in the future. So our research generally shows that the harms coming from AI assistants are quite widespread. They're quite diffuse and they're nuanced, and they might come up in different ways depending on the context they're being used in, the person who might be using the assistant, and also the kind of purpose they are being used for. So that all means that there's not one easy fix to manage the kind of risks that come from these systems. Instead, we need to consider advanced AI assistants holistically and situationally. The newness of some of these issues that we just discussed and what we will be discussing on this panel means that policymakers have to think outside of the box when developing policies and strategies to dealing with them. And we hope that the conversation we'll have here today is sort of laying some of the groundwork of having that conversation. And speak of the next part of the project, where over the next few months we will be engaging more with stakeholders and with the public to develop concrete recommendations on how to deal with these risks. And with that, I will pass it over to Karen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julia, and thank you all for being here this evening. Firstly, can I start by congratulating Ada on a really fabulous piece of work. If you haven't read the November report, it's really a good use of your time. So can I just encourage you to read it? It's really well done, and thank you for the thought leadership that you are displaying in this really fast-moving and important area. So, having flattered you all, now it's time for questions. Julia, can I start with you? You mentioned that some of the problems that you outline in your report are quite familiar ones. Actually, it's sort of, nothing new to see, but there is something novel about these agents that's different from the kinds of manipulative profiling that we've seen based on data-driven profiling that's become ubiquitous before. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about the novelty of these assistants that's different from what we've seen before.
Yeah, sure. So if we think about the kind of systems that we might have seen before that also could have maybe this kind of targeting or persuasive impact, you might think about personalized advertising, you might think about hyper nudging. I know that you've done some excellent research on that. So it's not as if these kind of concepts are completely new. However, what is new is that you didn't have a sort of personal relationship with your online advertising profile, right? So the way in which we've been targeted before has still been based on profiles and statistics rather than our individual data and an individual relationship that we've built up with these kinds of systems. So we really do see that people start to rely on the assistant based on the relationship they build up. They really feel they're building up something like a friendship or at least some kind of trusted advisorship with the chatbots that they're using. And this sort of more personalized approach really makes it all the more persuasive because people feel like they're getting a personal recommendation from a friend rather than being targeted on a social media platform by an advertising that might be shown to hundreds of people versus something being tailored to you specifically and your interests. So that creates a new sort of dynamic where these assistants, they gather a lot of your personal information and can tailor a recommendation very specifically to you in the way that you might be most receptive to getting that as well.
Yes, thank you. And this sustained interaction, which is getting lots of headlines, even today, particularly the potential to impact the mental health and well-being of children, but the impact on cognitive and emotional well-being as well as critical thinking skills is something that's been flagged. I just wonder if you can say, or if there's anything we can say at the moment about the connection between these AI assistants and those potential impacts on cognitive capacities, mental well-being, those general concerns that are starting to foment in public discussion.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think we can split it out kind of in two sections, one around mental well-being and one about cognitive thinking and critical thinking skills. So we start with the mental well-being. We see that the way that these systems are designed, some people are actually calling it addictive design as well, and that they're really having the kind of cues that make it very hard for people to log off and stop engaging with them, because we do have to remember that these are commercial products and they are designed to optimize engagement. So I even noticed it myself that when I was doing some field work for this and I was, chatting to some chatbots on Character AI, I haven't chatted there for months and I still get nudges on my email to log back in because my friend misses me. That's kind of wild. So first of all, you do really see that these systems are quite intense and getting people to keep engaging with them. And then at the same time, in the way that sort of what they say to you, the term for this psychophancy, so basically these systems, they say what you want to hear. They're very sort of, they really try to hype you up and say that you're doing great work, that you're very smart. And in a good way, this could be that you have this friend in your pocket that's your champion, but the downside of that could be that you have something in your pocket that you can talk to 24/7 that enforces some unhealthy thought patterns you might have. And so we've also seen some psychologists and psychiatrists really sound the alarm about AI-induced psychosis and those kind of risks. So overall, it can also sort of put you into sort of bubble where your unhealthy thinking is reinforced by these kind of systems. And also having a system like that is available to you 24/7. It tells you what you want to hear and it tells you you're amazing all the time. But it's maybe not the best way to set you up for what a healthy social interaction might look like with people in general. So there's also some risk there about how we set standards for like forming healthy social bonds, and that might end up isolating people and also leading to worsened mental health impacts besides all that like addictive design and those kind of questions. When it comes to the cognitive de-skilling, I think that's also a really key issue, particularly as we're seeing AI assistants also being plugged into universities, and we see lots of universities striking deals with different AI providers. And I think particularly when it comes to young people who are still learning their cognitive and like critical thinking skills, it is really quite risky to push these kind of systems in those spaces. Because what we see is that, first of all, AI systems sound very convincing. They're quite bad at expressing uncertainty. I think we've maybe all interacted with ChatGPT or some other kind of chatbot at some point and asked them, are you sure that that's right? Because I've read something else and it says it's wrong. And then they go, oh, no, sorry, you're right. I'm so sorry, this is the correct answer. But it sounded convincing in the first answer as well. So it requires us already sort of having knowledge and having critical thinking to critically challenge the outputs by the assistants. But that kind of knowledge is really hard to obtain if from the start you've been taught to rely on them. So it's a combination of the way answers are framed, that sound very convincing and certain, and also again the tailoring of answers to you and the way that you might be best able to receive that kind of information. So we don't really have a lot of very good research, I think, right now on like what the long-term impacts are for younger people, particularly to engage with these kind of systems over time. But I do think there are enough sort of early warning signals that we should be very careful about, especially letting young people interact with these systems over time when they've not had the chance yet to build up critical thinking skills of their own.
Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree with you more. So I'm keen to think about the broader economic landscape, because you're quite right, thinking about the social dimensions and the impact on our cognitive skills, our mental well-being, and our relationships. I'm really worried about that. And our capacity to relate to each other interpersonally and professionally. But if we think about the larger economic landscape, if I can turn to you, Max, and I know you've been doing a lot of thinking about the impact of these tools on how it affects the economic landscape. I wonder if you can say a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, just want to congratulate Julia and Harry for a fantastic report. I think there's a lot of hype and kind of vague language that's used in the AI debate right now, particularly when it comes to speculative benefits of what these things are going to do for society. And so I really appreciate you guys doing a very kind of well-researched, sober piece of research, looking at a lot of the risks of adopting these things. I think without thinking about them, and also these sort of broader societal risks. So I think to answer your question, I think it's worth sort of taking a step back for a second and thinking about what we've seen in digital markets over the past 10, 20 years, which is that what you often see is, you often start off with some disruption and some innovation and some products that people find useful, but then very quickly you tend to see a consolidation around a small number of players. And that happens for a number of reasons. Some of it is sort of structural factors that we see in digital markets. So things like network effects, everyone wants to be on the same platform, whether that's buyers or sellers. The sort of data feedback loops where, the business that gets more data by being more popular is then able to improve its product more and sort of moves further ahead of the rest of the pack. But then also a lot of it is to do with kind of anti-competitive practices. So we've seen, the existing big tech firms have used a lot of unfair tactics like bundling their products together, making it hard to carry your data over to another platform, buying up competitors before they're able to challenge them. So a lot of that contributes to the consolidation. And then added to that, you have the fact that in digital markets, unlike in other markets, which I think are easier to look at as kind of discrete units, in tech, often the things that make you dominant in one part of tech can then be leveraged to control another market. So things like data, for example, things like computing power, as well as kind of financial resources, can easily be leveraged from one market to another. And again, we've seen that many times. And so if we look at AI, I would say kind of all of these dynamics are in play. So I would say when it comes to AI, focusing on assistance, because that's the topic of your report, I think we see some of these more general things I mentioned, again, like network effects, where again, the same consumers and businesses want to be using the same assistant. Again, you see the data feedback loops where, as an assistant interacts with a person, they gather more data on them, they're able to provide, more tailored recommendations. But then I think on top of that, and again, you mentioned this, if you look at what the kind of dominant players so far in AI are aiming for, it is to have this kind of gatekeeper of all gatekeepers that basically does everything for you, that does your shopping, that gives you information, that books your holidays, that gives you financial advice. And so I think the potential for sort of concentration and scale is potentially much greater than what we've seen in today's existing kind of tech markets, which is already a big deal. And we've heard this from the companies themselves. So I often remember a quote that Sam Altman said, where he said, "Our goal with ChatGPT is that it remembers, every conversation you've ever had, every book you've ever read, every email you've ever sent, everything you've looked at will be in our data, and we'll be able to use it to provide you this kind of perfect service." And I think that's a very dangerous path to go down. I think another factor, so that's more about kind of, let's say, the market for assistants themselves, but I think it's important to look at where these tools are situated within the broader kind of tech stack. And again, there, I think the existing market means that the incumbents today have a lot of advantages. So if you think of, for example, the data, the computing power, the money that you need to train kind of cutting edge AI systems, companies like Google, Meta have huge advantages there. And then there's the question of distribution, right? So a lot of these systems are only kind of, or whether they're used or not depends on whether consumers see them. And again, the existing incumbents have platforms that already billions of people use, and they're able to push their solutions in front of people. So if you think of how Google, for example, now just automatically includes AI mode, or when you go on WhatsApp now, you have an AI agent. Like a small startup isn't able to do that because they don't own these broader ecosystems. And then finally, what you're also seeing, which is again kind of limiting the potential for competition and diversity, is this whole web of relationships between the bigger players and AI startups. So there's the partnership between Microsoft and OpenAI, for example, which is worth something like $15 billion and includes Microsoft giving OpenAI cloud compute and capital and so on. You have similar partnerships with Anthropic and Google and Amazon, for example. So that is also having a huge impact on the market structure. And I guess the basic question is, why should we be worried about this kind of concentration? And I think we'll talk about the sort of broader societal impacts in a sec, but just thinking more in kind of economic terms, I think for consumers it's problematic because we're locked into specific systems. We have a lot less choice. And that means either we pay higher prices if we're being charged for these systems, or kind of value is extracted from us in other ways. For example, by handing over more data than we would if in a market where there were lots of different choices. And I think that's already something we've seen in social media. For businesses, it's a problem because, again, if these AI assistants end up becoming this thing that mediates how everyone interacts with the internet, how people shop, then every business relies on these AI gatekeepers to reach consumers, to get their products in front of them. But also if they're building, for example, applications through the API of a popular AI model or agent, then they're completely at the behest of whoever operates that, including things like unfair terms and conditions and so on. And then I think there's a risk that we also see less innovation overall, both between AI systems themselves, because there are just fewer options, and so the incumbents can kind of rest on their laurels and just have their kind of locked-in user bases. And Cory Doctorow has talked about this idea of enshittification. Once you lock people in, you just kind of degrade the quality of your services. And in a concentrated market, as a consumer or a business, you can't do anything about that. You're just stuck there. And I think a lot of us have seen that using Google or Amazon, for example, over time. And then I think we'll talk about this afterwards. But again, there are also a lot of sort of broader societal risks that come out of that.
Yeah, so it's not looking good for the consumer if the market consolidates even further. The direction of travel certainly sounds like it is heading in that direction. But there are a range of broader systemic effects that knock on directly, particularly as information gatekeepers, if your prediction is right, Julia, that may have direct implications for the health of our political system. So I just wondered if you might say something about that and your sense of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there is a clear link between having a more concentrated market when it comes to these tools and the impact on democracy and on our political system. So I think some of these risks are not about market structure. So you could have a very small AI chatbot or assistant, for example, that gives you biased information or that produces deepfakes or misinformation or so on. But I think those risks are greatly amplified when there are only a few providers that a huge percentage of society is relying on. Right, so it's different if you have a 5% market share or a 30% market share in terms of your ability to shape public debate and shape the ideas that are being put in front of people, as you said. And I think some of those risks are potentially, unintentional. So, there are biases in the training data, political biases that weren't necessarily put there intentionally, but again, when a third of society is using a particular chatbot, those biases spread very wide. Again, similar with things like misinformation. But I think we do need to also think about the risks of these tools as actually being used intentionally to interfere with political debate. And so some of that is about questions of foreign interference. So, we know very well that Russia, for example, has tried often successfully to use social media to influence debate. And there's already evidence that they're trying to use chatbots, for example, to do so by prompt injection and sort of messing with the underlying training data to get certain narratives to spread. But I think we also can't rule out that the platforms themselves or the people that own them try and use sort of society's dependence on their assistants and chatbots and so on to influence how people think. So, there have been lots of studies of how Elon Musk, for example, has used his ownership of X to promote certain political narratives and swing elections in Germany or France or the UK. And I think the potential to do so would be even greater with these types of AI tools, precisely because, as you said, they're so conversational. They make you feel like you're just chatting with a mate or something. And that is also a real vector to shape people's political beliefs. So, I definitely think it's a very big risk. And in that sense, I think having a competitive, diverse market is not only good for consumers, but it's also a kind of bulwark against that sort of political interference.
Well, thank you, Max. I just want to stay with this implications for epistemic trust, actually, because I think it's really foundational to democracy and actually everything we do as a peaceful cooperative in a community. So I know, Tim, that you've already conducted quite a bit of research on AI summaries of news, which are really salient for the kind of discussion that we're having. I just wondered if you might tell us a bit more about that research and what the implications might be for thinking about AI assistance.
Yeah, of course. I guess before I go into that, I just want to set the scene of what usage looks like as well, because I think it's useful. So at Ipsos, we have a tool called Iris, which is UConn-approved online measurement tool. So it looks at people's online behaviour. It's a really big panel. See me afterwards if you want to get into technicalities of it. But essentially, the latest data, because I checked today, is 21 million people last month used an LLM-driven AI. Now, that's specific to the ones that we can see, so it's a web address. So that is probably a low estimate, because that misses where it's being imbued into all other things, like Google search, for example. And all the other places that you can find it. And that's up 78% year on year from the same month last year. So it is big and growing. So within the UK, it's already like a common practice, right? The study we did was specifically in partnership with the BBC, and they commissioned us to look into the perceptions and use around AI tools specifically for news and information, look at how they respond to errors, whether they're sort of aware or conscious of them. Then we show them. We actually showed them some examples that we mocked up that did have errors in, see whether they noticed them. They didn't. Not that we'd expect them to, because it was a random topic that we chose, but also then how they reacted to it, and then ultimately who they find sort of accountable and responsible for those. Headlines, without going into the reports in the public domain, and so if you search something like BBC AI Trust Ipsos, you'll probably find it, or just ask me, find me on LinkedIn. The kind of key findings that I think are pertinent to this discussion, upfront, 1 in 3 sort of trust AI to produce accurate information. There's this implicit belief that because AI is a machine, for want of a better word, put information in, get the same information out. And that's just not the case, which I think certainly everyone in the panel, I think, would agree with. So yeah, they come in with that implicit trust. But when they see errors, naturally there is there, or when they're told there are errors in it, naturally that has a significant impact on that trust. So it does devalue. So as long as we're having open conversations about it, people seem to sort of get, okay, well, now I might be a bit more attentive about actually checking. One of the most interesting things, though, was around who they think is actually responsible for those errors. So naturally, the sort of majority fall on either the tech company, it's about a third, said the actual companies behind the AIs were responsible. Another third said sort of regulators, government, like they should be responsible for making sure it's accurate and reliable and everything else. But interestingly, there was this kind of stubborn quarter that seemed to insist that actually it's the media organisations that are producing those news who should bear responsibility for it. Whether they've been involved in the AI production, like the AI summary at all or not, which we know the way it's implemented today, a lot of the times the media organisation has nothing to do with it. They have no quality checks, they have no investment, it's just being sort of scraped and used and summarised, often from multiple sources as well. So yeah, I think that was one of the big challenges. One of the things around sort of that trust, and we did dig into whether people do actually check. It's hard to do in survey and qual interviews, which were both part of this because people aren't necessarily going to be truly honest. But we still saw there this sort of contradiction in people saying, "Oh yeah, no, it's really important to check this information, right? I can't just implicitly trust it. That would be ridiculous." And then you kind of elsewhere we kind of asked them, "Yeah, but do you?" So, yeah. It's a machine. Information in, information out. It should be that simple, right? So I think that was one of this kind of big. There's also a whole section I could go into, which I won't. We kind of touched on some of what Julia was touching on as well, of sort of the trust signals that are available with these places. You think of when you search and you get a new summary there, you get the sort of little icons of the media brands that maybe have fed into it. These little sort of signals of, oh, look, you can trust this summary and that it's been accurate. It's an accurate representation of what was there before. The BBC have done their own work into actually the accuracy of it. Again, you can sort of in the public domain, you can find that. It wasn't done with us; it was their own one. They got a bunch of journalists to check their own stories that were then reproduced in AI, which seems like a really harsh thing to do to the journalist. But anyway. I think what we really saw overall was this veneer of sort of trust and signals that encourage trust and accuracy is a sort of natural starting point that then does get undermined when errors are found. But the odds of those errors being found is sort of the unknown, right? Because you don't know something's wrong until you're told it's wrong. And as I already said, AIs aren't very inclined to tell you that they've got something wrong in the first place.
So I'm really interested in the work that you did. Did you identify any variables that influenced whether or not someone was likely to fact check information? What makes someone more or less likely to fact check what they've been fed?
Yeah, so we definitely saw, I think, one of the key things actually from another piece which is about to come out, which is again with the BBC in the next couple of weeks, because well, much like Ada, I think we've had just loads of AI projects in the last couple of months, and now they're all being launched before Christmas. This one, one of the things we really saw there was this sense that actually sort of knowledge begets more questions. So this is where I think AI adoption, we're seeing it as quite a different to other technologies we've seen in the past, where sort of you find value, you continue to use it, you sort of optimize your usage around your life or around how you want to use it, and you sort of continue. Whereas with AI, we see those people who are high users, actually they end up with sort of usage and they see the value, but then they have more sort of bigger questions about where's the data coming from? What's the quality of it? What's the accuracy of it? Actually, what does this mean existentially for humanity? So actually in this study, we saw some areas around concerns of sort of skill degradation, and also somewhat encouragingly concern for what it might mean for other people's jobs. Like people actually concerned about other people, which we don't always see. So I think the one sort of deeper question is actually usage meant that they had usage triggered deeper questions rather than sort of just overall comfort. So actually, the comfort comes from those who are early in their adoption phase, which tends to broadly skew sort of older at the moment as well, because it's a younger audience that tends to use it.
I mean, I want to pick up on that because your study was about sort of AI news summaries, and I'm trying to imagine what the implications might be applying that logic or what you learned from that to these advanced AI assistants. I mean, I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on that. Does it mean that over time people might be less likely to trust their AI companion? I mean, I don't know. I'm just wondering.
But without the ability to see what the AI's got wrong, that's the sort of big black hole in the middle of this, right? That yes, you would hope they would if they start to understand that the assistants aren't always right. Hopefully that will become a sort of more ubiquitous understanding among the general public. But unless you know what the AI's got wrong, how can you then know what not to trust and what to trust? We're still approaching it seemingly with that sort of sense of trust to start with. So it's an interesting area that we don't really know what the picture is, right? Because it's still very much early in its phase. Just think, ChatGPT was only, what, 2 years ago? I'm now questioning my dates. Is it 3? No, but the sort of mass consumer launch was sort of in 2 years, and it's already got to, as I said, that 21 million figure. And ChatGPT, by the way, is by far the leader in terms of the platforms that it's visited as well on that, within that 21.
Interesting, really fascinating. We'll watch your space there. Thank you, Tim. And I want to turn now to thinking about some of the legal implications. So, Alex, I'm going to put you in the hot seat, and you did a really extensive piece of work on considering the extent to which existing legal regulation in England and Wales addressed the harms that have been identified in that ADA report, and it wasn't very optimistic about the capability. So I just wondered from that analytical piece that you did, whether you identified any potential easy wins or low-hanging fruit, things that we could do that wouldn't be too difficult, that could actually be beneficial.
Yeah, well, in the report, we weren't looking to recommend changes, so we weren't looking specifically at that. But I do have some thoughts. I mean, I think the first thing to say about low-hanging fruit is new primary legislation is never going to be low-hanging fruit, generally speaking. So anyone who, for example, worked on the Online Safety Act or the Online Arms Act, as it used to be called, will well know that, the journey that those kind of pieces of legislation take and the time taken. Having said that, though, I mean, one area potentially is changes to the product liability regime in the UK. So we see that a major issue with these tools is that they are not products for the purposes of product liability regimes in the UK and currently in the EU, because products need to be embodied at the moment, and these are not. The EU is already taking action to change that, so the EU is updating the Product Liability Directive, and I think that will come in 2026. And the Law Commission is looking at whether changes need to be made to the UK's product liability regime. So that could be a change which would make a really big difference to some of the harms in the paper. Having said that, it's only going to be a partial solution, so you still have some of the problems with access to justice that we talk about in the paper, and I think any changes in that direction will face serious trade-offs and questions about whether it's going to constrain innovation, for example. I think that's true of legislative change, but also actions by regulators to enforce existing regulations as well. The headwinds running against regulation of these tools are really strong. Thinking about existing regulation, I mean, one possible easy win where there are existing regulations and regulators with the power to enforce them, which there definitely are in some areas, would be to improve the information which is available to those regulators. I think that's quite mixed at the moment. And something that we pick up on is the AI Security Institute, or the AI Safety Institute as was, which at the moment it's to me at least, it's a bit vague exactly what role it plays, but it certainly claims to have privileged access to some of these models. And I think it would be really interesting to see that put on a firm footing and see explicit provision made for that privileged access to be used to benefit regulators, to help them do their jobs better. Thinking about regulation, though, generally, I think that's really mixed enforcement of existing regulation. Definitely in some areas, so for example, financial services, there seems to be quite a lot of scope. I personally don't see how the situation with financial advice provided by tools such as ChatGPT is sustainable. I don't know that the FCA is doing anything about it, but millions of people are obtaining what arguably ought to be regulated financial advice from these tools now. That is a huge change in that market, and I don't really see how that can continue. But then if you look somewhere like the Online Safety Act, I think there's a lot of pressure and a lot of maybe hope from people that, well, these are online tools, people access them through the internet, and the Online Safety Act is about protecting children on the internet. But actually, when you look into the details, stretching the obligations under the OSA to fit some of these harms is very, very difficult, if not impossible. And I think Ofcom has a big challenge on its hands, and I know that Ofcom is talking up, if you like, the scope of the OSA and its ability to deal with some of these harms, but personally I'm quite sceptical. And then last one, it's not really a low-hanging fruit, but I do want to mention access to justice. I mean, just to be really clear about what the issue is here, we talk about effective protection from these harms and effective redress. So the issue is not there are no laws. There are a lot of laws, way more laws even in this paper than any one solicitor can be an expert in. But often the problem is that the rights that those laws entitle us to cannot be practically enforced because it's too expensive to litigate. You cannot bring opt-out group claims in the UK except before the Competition Appeal Tribunal. You cannot really get legal aid practically for these kinds of claims. So that the access to justice situation in the UK is very bad and it's getting worse. So there are some things that I would really like to see fixed there.
Here. On that note, I just wondered whether there are other jurisdictions that are better served in terms of potential sources of safeguards that we don't have, that we might learn from, or interesting laboratories.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to stress the differences too much, but I think we can definitely think about, say, the EU and the US. So if you look at the EU, and it relates back to some of the things I've already mentioned, the AI Act I kind of leave to one side largely. I mean, most of the key provisions there haven't really been enforced yet anyway. There are some provisions which deal with general purpose AI models, but they're mainly to do with systemic risks and not so much the individual harms that we were thinking about here. So jury's out on the AI Act. But I already mentioned the changes they're making to the Product Liability Directive. I think that's really positive. Generally speaking, the position on GDPR enforcement in the EU is stronger than in the UK, certainly in some of the member states anyway. So that's probably helpful. And then you have things like the Collective Redress Directive. Again, it does vary by member states. So if you look at, say, the Netherlands, like possibly soon Spain and Portugal, you have really good opt-out regimes. And, you know, companies really hate it. But that's because this is the kind of action that they are actually scared of. It's the kind of thing that can really put pressure on their bottom line, like these big opt-out claims. And even if they involve commercial or third-party litigation funders, which some people are not so comfortable with. And maybe Europe's a bit ahead on the kind of Competition and Digital Markets Act enforcement as well. The DMCCA is like a bit newer, like not really sure what the CMA is doing there. And on the US, I mean, I think I'll just say, I think counterintuitively, consumers in the US might be better protected than they are here in some ways. One of the issues we identify is the problems with duties. So in the common law, duties of care, and that being a big barrier to kind of claims in some of these areas. So if you think about the suicide cases, ChatGPT suicide cases in the US, of which there are many, and it's a growing number. A case like that would be very difficult to bring in the UK. There is no established duty of care that would neatly apply to that situation in the UK, and the courts in the UK are very cautious about establishing new duties. whereas in the US it's much more flexible. So it can actually be easier to bring claims of that nature in the US, even though they kind of lack regulation. Taking it out of the AI context, many of you might be aware of the case of Lloyd and Google, which was actually not GDPR because it was pre-GDPR, but data protection basically. And the upshot was it failed, so the consumers in that case didn't get any compensation. Consumers in the US were compensated for that same thing. Okay, so Google had to pay out billions of dollars for that same thing, but there's no GDPR or Data Protection Act in the US, but they still had to because of the class action regime in the US. So again, it comes back to access to justice. Even places where there seems to be less regulation, if you can get access to justice, access to the courts, then it can make a difference.
So can I just, I'm interested to ask a follow-up on that. Do you think actually collective redress is quite an important instrument there?
Yes. Yeah, I think, and there is sort of gateway provision for it in the GDPR and the UK GDPR. So there's an invitation, if you like, to Parliament to enact some kind of collective redress regime for GDPR claims, but I would also like to see it go wider as well. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what you said about competition law. I think competition law is unlike a lot of the things you were talking about, something that can be used already. So the UK has competition laws, the EU has competition laws, the US, but I mean hundreds of countries do. And I think the good thing about them is they aren't technology or industry specific. They can be used in any area where you have a company that's sort of abusing its power over consumers or over businesses. And I think while it wouldn't necessarily address some of the specific harms that we're talking about, it would ensure that you sort of maintain a certain number of providers in the market so that, if you are being sort of having a bad experience with one assistant, you can move to another one, and it would also, prevent any player becoming so big that something going wrong with their systems has that kind of systemic impact on society. So yeah, I think that's something I would like to see regulators using much more than they are.
Absolutely, and I think you're right that there are some potential existing tools, but my sense is there's not a lot of appetite for enforcement. And when you're up against some pretty big players, that's kind of understandable, particularly given how squeezed public budgets are. So I think that that's a real, not to mention toxic waste dumps that we've been seeing in the UK. So I think the enforcement is really important, and that's really resource intensive, and it takes real commitment to carry those things through. So I'm with you on that one. Just while we're on this subject of potential solutions, Carrie, can I turn to you? And I know that not in this November report, but elsewhere, there appears to be some wariness that you have about reaching for legal solutions or legal intervention in response to some of the negative impacts that may be flowing down from these AI assistants. And I just wondered if you can say a little bit more about the way you're currently thinking about this, or why you're somewhat hesitant to think that legal regulation might be the way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm kind of glad you asked. I think it's something which, the way I express it, I need to be really careful. I think also put a pin in things like common law remedies, because I think that's a huge avenue that is potentially really interesting to explore. I think the thing that I've been really keen to convey, and I think this is given the structure of the research that we've been doing, and I guess kind of implied teleology with our research, whereby we've done a lot of work looking at what the potential challenges around advanced AI assistants are. We've then done this legal review. And I think there was a way of looking at that where you go, oh, okay, those are the challenges, those are the gaps in regulation, those are the problems. And therefore, this policy development challenge we now have is a case of filling in those particular gaps. And I guess all I'm trying to do is really emphasize that there are lots of cases where it's not going to be that simple, and that we're going to have to look really broadly and expansively about the things that we need to be doing. So I think probably there are some straightforward changes which we could make in a reasonable short term, which would help with many aspects of some of the issues that we're seeing with these systems. So there's probably quite a lot of stuff that we can do around dual use problems. So potentially looking at generalist AI assistants which are not trained to do these things and don't have any of the legal safeguards around, where they're providing things like specialist legal advice, financial advice. You have the issue of ChatGPT kind of very quickly turning into a therapist where that's not something which has been solicited and it's not something for which it is qualified. So there are probably straightforward things that we can do there in terms of redefining the scope of existing legislation, which would apply to things like regulated professions. There is probably some stuff that we can also do around, say, the blurred line between advertising and recommendations, and maybe thinking about how existing advertising standards are being enforced. But I think so many of the questions that we've been keen to emphasize in these reports are these really kind of diffuse, subtle questions where you have a harm which is really only visible in the aggregate, where we don't really have good legal tools for conceiving of those sorts of harms, let alone dealing with them. So if you think about someone having a sustained change in their worldview as a result of really long-term interaction with one of these systems, that's the kind of thing where if you were to try and develop regulation or statute to deal with that at the point of the actual harm, it would either be really, really awkwardly suited or it would be actively dangerous in the sense that, well, what we're worried about here is the power these laws have over people's worldviews. Do we really want to be putting that power in the hands of the legislature, for instance? I think we need to be really, really careful about jumping to those sorts of solutions. I think maybe in the long term, what I would kind of encourage is thinking a lot about some of the very way upstream solutions to this. So thinking about some of the financial relationships between, say, people providing these sorts of things and people who want to do de facto advertising through these systems, taking out some of the most egregious kind of economic incentives to sway people's views. That may be something we want to look at. And then also way downstream. So thinking about what AC would call societal resilience. Thinking about how, well, if there are going to be some forms of these tools, how do we build a population which is equipped to cope with this constant barrage of persuasion? So I think just really encouraging us to kind of widen up the scope of tools that we're kind of bringing to this really complicated, expansive problem.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for the systemic risks that you identify, those are going to be really challenging in terms of existing institutional frameworks that we have to address them in a meaningful way. So that's going to be an interesting conversation to have to take forward. Thank you to our fabulous panelists. I'm sorry we've gone a little bit over time and even into the audience Q&A time, but I want to open up the discussion to those that I can see one enthusiastic person already, so I'll do my best at navigating. So please, do we have a microphone? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the discussion. It's really inspiring. I'm Dr. Chayo Chen and I teach at Burbank College. I'm also the program director of the social research program there. And at Burbank, I'm running AI for social research workshop. So I really appreciate the report. And I'm going to assign your report to my students and ask them to then read the report very closely. So I actually don't have a really good answer to the question I'm going to ask, and I suspect, this would be some kind of something for future or ongoing research, because when I was reading the report, you used the word delegation, and my background is political economy. So when it comes to the economic literature about delegation, all kinds of ideas coming, right? For instance, why do we see delegation, and why delegation will become counterproductive? And how can we come up with potential or feasible solutions to address something we call the dilemma of delegation or even the agency loss? And I was having a conversation with my friends who work at MIT, and he said, Chayo, it's probably potentially a good idea to bring in the economic model of delegation to think about everything we are talking about today, right? Because I think in the report, I can see two things that have been done really well. One is to come up with a new idea of AI system. When we are so preoccupied with all the discussion about agentic AI, whatever that is. And the second thing is about the risk assessment, right? So there are three kinds of challenges. But I'm just wondering, maybe it's useful to bring in the ideas from the economic model of delegation, right? For instance, economic model of delegation will talk about principal wants to delegate because of they are risk averse. And delegation could potentially be counterproductive because there will be issues of information asymmetry. However, at a theoretical level, they are really intuitive. But if you put that into the context of AI, then all kinds of questions, will come out, right? What kind of delegation relationship are we talking about? Who is the principal? Who is the agent? right? And the second, if we're talking about solutions, the literature gives us at least two solutions. One is police patrol, the other one is fire alarm. Then given all kinds of solutions we've been trying to think about here, maybe there's a way, to bring in these two theoretical ideas to think about either we can do well, the way I think about these two solutions is, one type of solutions is more preventive and the other kind of solutions is more ad hoc, like, you're trying to do damage control after delegation takes place. So I'm just wondering, if either the institute or maybe any panelists that have been thinking about, trying to bring in the literature, maybe I think, at just some level, we can just do a survey or whatever, but I don't think theoretically speaking, there's something we can do more about it.
I'm going to ask my panel if you have a response.
Yeah, firstly, thanks so much for the really kind words about the reports. And yes, please do assign it to your students. Add that into some kind of register somewhere. In terms of bringing a kind of economic model to think about some of these issues around delegation, I think that sounds like a really fascinating thing to do. We will have to think about that. Let's have a chat more about that. I suppose some questions I would have around that is when you are kind of delegating a bunch of decisions to an AI system, I guess it makes assumptions about, firstly, the extent to which your preferences are fixed, to the extent that you know them at all, and then if they are fixed, can you codify them and specify them to an AI system with a sufficient degree of kind of nuance and granularity that you're happy for them to go out and make decisions on your part? And also, how long does that take? How onerous a process is that? And if you don't do that, maybe there's a way that an AI system can kind of do it through quote unquote revealed preferences. Now, I think there is a really interesting question about the extent to which people's revealed preferences are what they would want an AI system to do for them in their enlightened self-interest. So I think some of the questions that I would kind of think about when thinking about preference satisfaction through that lens might have got the wrong end of the stick though. So let's talk about that more. But it sounds like a really useful lens to bring to this, maybe something we can run with. So thanks so much.
Thank you. And Paul. Over there, and then I'll see one over there.
Thank you. Paul Waller, researcher, but in this context, former policy civil servant as well. First of all, I think we need to set aside questions about the will of the government at the moment to do absolutely anything at all in this space. But beyond that, I think we all been thinking primarily about kind of direct regulation, looking at the product as a thing. Are we thinking around alternative policy instruments here about things where there's a political judgment made that something is bad for us? So, for example, we tax sugar. We now tax sugar content of things. We put health warnings on fag packets. We run public health campaigns about, used to be wearing seatbelts, so it showed my age. But anything like that, where there's I think there's quite a wide range of things with a bit of imagination and cooperation, working with ISPs and people like that might be things to do. Any thoughts on that? Thank you.
I think it's a fascinating idea, and it's definitely a policy lever that was maybe outside of what we have been thinking about, and that was exactly what we were hoping for with this conversation, is for people to bring in stuff that we hadn't thought about. I think that may be a vote for the AI stop tax in addition to the sugar tax and all of the others. I guess one thought with some using kind of Pigouvian taxes, for instance, or that sort of mechanism to kind of dissuade people from using certain systems or to add a certain kind of cost and to kind of set direction to the markets. One thing is we'd have to be pretty sure the perceived benefits of using that kind of technology, people's level of dependence, was something that a small tax could actually sway people away from, that's the kind of thing that could push people away. I suppose the other thing I wonder about is the extent to which governments can become financially and fiscally dependent on certain activities because there is a tax base behind them. So I think there would be things to think about there, but I think certainly it's kind of an avenue of intervention that we haven't been thinking about so far. So I think that's really, really useful one to add into the mix.
Yeah, I maybe just wanted to talk about, you talked about sort of health warning type information things, and it's something you thought about a bit when we were doing the legal paper. I mean, I think there's probably already a bit out there. So there'll be regulators, definitely people like the ICO and the FCA, who will be talking a little bit to consumers about being careful about the extent to which they rely on these tools. But actually, the tools themselves have those health warnings on them. So if you look at their terms and conditions, or even directly after the answers, you know, they say often involved, do not rely on anything that this tool says. But of course, that doesn't stop people relying on it. So I think there are real limits to the extent to which better informing consumers can solve some of these issues. I think what has maybe taken us all, like the world, by surprise in the last 3 years is just how much unmet demand there was for letting go of mental load among consumers. People are desperate not to have to think about these things, and that's why they're using these tools so much. So I think there's a risk that you can put as much information out there as you want, but people don't want to read it. That's why they like using ChatGPT, because they don't have to read too much stuff.
Do you think it was unmet demand or stimulated demand?
Yeah.
No, I think humans are lazy.
Yeah, absolutely. Humans are lazy. I think that's right. We put it back and then we've been done.
Thank you. Hello, Lubita Polako, I work at Wilton Park. I have a question around skills. So I haven't read the report in full. Apologies for not doing my homework. But I was wondering if the panel have any thoughts on where any upskilling interventions could or should be targeted, especially especially thinking of people who have already left the formal school system. I mean, for example, we see a lot of thinking about what savings AI could make for various companies, and how, yes, you should have a human in the loop, but how do we maintain a pipeline of people who have the critical skills and the knowledge to be the human in the loop? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really key question, because I think a lot of regulatory policy responses really presume that there is going to be a sort of qualified, skilled human who's able to check whatever an AI assistant or any other system in general does. And that's a very big presumption to have, especially if you're actively putting systems in place that engender a sort of dependency. In terms of active interventions and like upskilling, I think first of all, there's a very big need to demystify what AI systems are actually capable of. Not a lot of people understand that anything an AI system creates is a sort of statistical interference, and that hallucinations are not this kind of issue that are, it happens every once in a while, it makes a little mistake. Now, if you really look at how it works, in effect, every single output it produces is a kind of hallucination. It's just sometimes right. And people don't understand that that is the kind of system they're relying on. And combined with that sort of persuasiveness and certainty with which they present information, you also push people to kind of, like, the company says, please use this AI assistant, and the AI assistant itself sounds very convincing. And those two things together lead people to think, oh, I can trust this. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about the kind of trust that people have, and like in what kind of situations it can be helpful to have an assistant. For instance, you have certain ideas and you want to suss them out a little bit more, and it's nice to have like kind of sparring partner maybe to like think through your ideas and your own thoughts. That might be, a useful kind of context in which you're using it as a partner, but not as a sort of key thinker in the problem that you have. So I think a lot of the intervention really needs to be about, is maybe not even upskilling, it's just getting people to understand the system they're working with and giving them really good information and accessible information in a way that they know what they can use it for and what they actually what it just can do.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front there with Laura, I don't know what the gentleman behind. Thank you.
Sorry, my question follows
Sorry.
on from the Bitzer's question. Do you actually see employers using this that, since most of your tasks are being done by this application, therefore your value reduces? Now, if somehow they become less operational, hence the tasks they were doing, they're not doing because of delegation or it's done automatically. How do you see employees protecting their living standards going forward? Or do you think the law would have something in there to protect this? Because I can give my own example. When I joined this corporation many years ago, many of the tasks I used to do manually, I don't do them. In fact, anybody joining today will not be doing at least 50 to 70% of those tasks manually because it's all done.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely huge, expansive, and I think kind of age-old question, which is the effect of automation and now specifically effect of a particular kind of AI on employment, on tasks within the work, and the power dynamic between employers and employees. I think one of the things that lots of economists like to claim is that this will be like every other single wave of automation which has gone across an economy in the past, and there will be new tasks created. I think there are open questions about whether that is true for something like general purpose AI, which is so generalist in its application. So jury's very much out, I think, still on whether or not this will be like all the others or whether this time it's really different. I think there are also questions about whether these sorts of systems, so advanced AI systems, are going to make individual workers overall more productive, or whether they are going to be having the kind of generality which allows them to it allows employers to get away with fewer employees, or whether they can replace entire jobs. On that, I would say that there has been really, really good work by the MIT economist Darren Acemoglu, who has looked at some of these things, look at the difference between, for instance, task replacement and job replacement. And there are some really, really good reports which I found very demystifying on some of these very, very kind of tumultuous debates about what this means for employers and dynamics between labour and firms.
Thank you. So I've got the gentleman in the second row, Laura in the first row, and I've got Tess up the back. Thank you. So this is gentleman here. Thank you.
Hi, Tom. I'm a lawyer. In the spirit of Christmas, if someone could give you the gift of an insight or a piece of evidence that you don't otherwise have, what would you like?
Question.
I think if I was going to go first, I'm very curious about the answers of the other panelists. I think so much of these systems are kind of as alluded to in some of the questions, presume that there's a certain productivity gain to be had. And we actually have no good evidence on that at all. And so I think to have some conclusive piece of evidence that really shows this is where it enhances productivity, this is where it maybe enhances worker satisfaction, and this is actually where it adds nothing, that would be great, because then we can make some really good policy around it and also push through a bit of the hype and say, okay, actually, in a lot of these circumstances, it might not be so good to plug this kind of AI assistant into this. So I would say some good evidence around productivity and not just hypey claims.
Anyone else on that? Yeah, so can I say one of the things I'd love to know, the conditions under which these assistants produce tangible benefits that are quantifiable, and how other and costs, what kind of costs, and the distribution of those costs and benefits. That's what I'd like to know.
So presumably for both of those, you need standardised benchmarks and ways of calculating both cost and productivity gain across all these different scenarios.
Yeah, and not just productivity gain, as well as other kinds of gains, as well as other kinds of losses. So that's, you know, we've been using numbers and dollars for a long time. So there's a currency for that. Thank you, Laura, and then Tess at the back.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to have been able to come to this evening and hear these excellent views. I'm trying to sort of put everything that we've discussed, or that has been discussed, together. And one of the questions that I'm left with is, where should responsibilities lie? We've talked about regulation at the top. We've talked about individuals getting redress at the moment. We've talked about how important it is that people understand the limitations of the AI, but at the same time, people don't like to read. So it's a bit of a tricky situation. I mean, I think in terms of regulation, again, we talked about data protection. So data protection often relies on individuals realizing there is something going wrong and making a complaint. You can also have requirements where companies are provided to provide assurances or provide put in certain conditions, that then needs to be checked. Then we need to check the checkers. There's issues with humans in the loop. So my question is really kind of, where should we be looking to tack on responsibilities in this space? Is it a case that there should be responsibilities kind of at every different stage, but in different ways? Is it even that simple? Should it be left to the courts? And how can we deal with a public awareness problem? So I'm terribly sorry to have so many questions. Feel free to answer any of them if we like.
I have a bit of an opening gambit to that, which is it probably will be a combination of all of those. I think one of the themes in the conversation we've been having over the evening is because some of the characteristics of advanced AI assistants are they're very persuasive, they're very personal, they're very good at short-circuiting the system one thinking, they're very good at kind of getting us to just quickly kind of delegate responsibility to them. I think it's it will be very, very difficult, and I think it will be potentially misguided when we're thinking about the division of labour between those different tiers of responsibility, to put too much responsibility on individuals when we know just how good these systems are at circumventing some of the natural C defences that we might have cognitively against these things. So I think we should be talking about educating people on the limitations of these systems. We probably should be thinking about the extent to which our education system kind of pushes people towards relying on these systems really early on and kind of developing these kind of dependencies. But there is probably a hard limit to personal responsibility as a means of dealing with these issues. And I think some of the really big questions are going to be, well, if not that, how are we going to get some of these other interventions to work?
And Max, thanks.
Yes, I don't think we can put much of the burden on consumers. I think if you look at, I think as you mentioned, people don't really read the terms and conditions, right? So I think things like giving people more transparency, not sure how effective that is. I think also if you look at attempts already which are focused on kind of empowering consumers, things like in the GDPR, the ability to port your data or to challenge automated decisions, like very few people actually use those rights. So I think we need to be realistic about what people will actually do. I do think where, consumers can play a role or where we can help consumers is by making sure that they still have effective choice. So I talked earlier about how much lock-in we see on digital platforms where, even if you don't like the platform you're using for whatever reason, it's extremely hard to leave. You can't move your contacts or your data over or anything. So I think both in tech in general, but also with the AI assistants, we need to make it very easy, including through regulation, for people to basically leave when they're not having a good experience. And I think that will be a natural way of keeping kind of individual companies in check. But I think beyond that, it's a mixture of sort of basically regulation, which we've already talked a lot about. And then, I think making sure we have a sort of market structure where no one actor is so powerful that they can essentially have sort of pose systemic risks to society, whether those are economic or democratic resilience, etc.
Yeah, Alex.
Just want to quickly say, yes, of course, at all levels, and there already is responsibility at all levels. Much as we might not want to push the responsibility onto individuals, the law, of course, expects individuals to look after themselves. No court is going to look kindly at a person turning up and saying, well, I, decided to stop thinking about my own life or how to make decisions. But I think what you can think about is a lens of maybe like centralization and decentralization. Like at the moment, what we have is like quite a centralized model of enforcement for lots of these kinds of risks. It's like very much thinking about regulators that sit in capital cities and they need budgets. They're subject to regulatory capture and political headwinds. Whereas like civil claims, for example, including group actions, that can be thought of as decentralized enforcement of the law, right? It's just a different way of doing it. So I think we can think about whether we've got the balance right between centralization and decentralization, like the online, and there's the centralization is very much in vogue at the moment. The Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the Online Safety Act, these are centralized models. They don't give people new rights. The Online Safety Act talks about a duty of care. The one thing the Online Safety Act doesn't have in it is a duty of care, because it doesn't give anyone any rights that they can actually enforce against platforms. So I think that thinking about the balance is key.
Yeah. Thank you. Tess up the back, you have a question? Do you still have it, or have you?
I do. And then Declan after.
And then after that, I think we might wrap up.
said I kind of have it because I wanted to create some space for liability, which Laura kind of did there. But for a bit more context, I'm hoping to do some work with procurement teams and investors and their roles to play here in 2026. So perspective on due diligence and the importance of that process, and things like contract and tort law that I see a lot of my membership companies leaning on or pointing to. And then perhaps also some comment if you guys have anything to say around AI insurance and its role to play as a market mechanism. I'm doing a lot of work on AI assurance, and I feel like there's a bit of a feedback loop there happening as an incentive structure in the market right now.
It's a very good question, and it's something that I have been thinking about with some colleagues here at ADA in general, like how these different kind of mechanisms around torts, contracts, insurance, assurance, how these all kind of like work together. It's like a private AI governance thing. I was actually in Copenhagen this weekend to put on a workshop on AI governance, so we should definitely keep talking about this. To say about the liability and contracts question is, we also just published a report on Monday, which is specifically on liability. And one of the key things that we signal there is that contracts are effectively being used to push certain types of liability down the value chain and away from sort of big providers that sit more on top of that value chain, which creates some certain situations in which, in an optimal model, you would have that sort of diffuse responsibility between different actors, but contracts are being used to push that away to the extent legally possible. So also, if we're thinking about AI systems in general, we might want to think about, can we somewhat expand unfair contract terms to give people a bit more ability to push back against unfair contracts that create unequal burdens? With regards to insurance, this is something a lot of people are talking about, because insurance is also in a way sort of private mechanism of creating an incentive to create more safer, more responsible products, right? Because no insurer will want to cover a product that's so risky that it will be paying out claims all the time. So idea is, okay, maybe the insurer will step in and like sort of provide this mechanism. There might be some potential there, and I think the potential is bigger for narrow AI systems where the risks are a bit better defined and a bit more easy to quantify. Because for a lot of general purpose AI systems, and the way that a lot of some AI assistants are narrow, but a lot of them are also general purpose. And for those, it's really hard to quantify what kind of risks are going to come out of this. And insurers are profit-driven entities. They will not be covering this kind of risk. They can quantify them. So I think there is some potential there, but we shouldn't look at insurers just to solve the whole sort of problem in that way. But it's a piece of the puzzle. Yeah.
Thank you. Great question. Harry, I'm going to hand over to you for closing remarks. Thank you.
Sorry, I think
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
Oh, let's go for one more question then.
Hopefully it builds off Tessa's question quite well, actually. Thinking along the same lines here. So actually, I was just going to ask a question about the extent to which this is about regulating the tool itself, or actually the environment the tool is in. And when we talk about environment, I don't just mean context. I mean, like, what data does that tool have access to? What users? What APIs? That kind of thing. You can think of parallels: cars go on roads, doctors and MRI machines go in hospitals, fridges and cooks go in restaurants. And in these contexts, people, to the question of how do people engage with these tools and understand them, in those contexts which are regulated, people understand those environments and they trust those environments more so than perhaps the tools and expertise within them. So building on Tessa's question, to what extent are we just looking at an immature product and services market where procurement, the right kind of procurement, hasn't happened yet? You've got a quarter of teams using chatbots for mental health advice. Is that a problem with them using the tool itself, or is that more about creating a safe environment through the right procurement and regulations in context, people to actually just use those tools?
So on the distinction between regulating the tool itself and regulating the environment in which it's deployed, I think probably part of regulating the tool itself will be the maturity of the technology. I think one of the experiences we've seen from the trajectory of the AI Act is taking an exclusively product safety approach to something as general purpose as GPAI. Just leads to a huge amount of issues. So I think a lot of this, in terms of that division of labour, we can't expect exclusively to be focusing on the product and the product's performance. We do also probably need to concentrate quite a lot on the circumstances and the environment of deployment. Brilliant. Well, we have gone a little bit over time, and therefore the pretzel to time ratio is not in our favour. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone, for what I think has been a really fascinating discussion. It's been very, very useful to us. All I will do before I will release you out to the canapes is just thank you so much, and just to stress again that this is a conversation that we want to keep going. This is a conversation that we want to keep having with all of you. So if any of you are particularly keen to talk through any of this, please grab us afterwards, please get in contact. We are very much in the market for ideas and for interlocutors on these questions. But now let's go and have a beer. Thank you so much.